submitted the draft Data Privacy and Security Plan for Smart Columbus today. It's a very rough draft, but we were able to get 2 Moritz Law students hired to assist us with this and finding models out there and model language and things like that to help us with that. So that was a nice experience to be able to follow that. So I was told to give a TED talk, something like a TED talk today. I don't know if I can give a good TED talk, but I do know that I already feel cooler because I'm giving it. So I'm going to give it a try. And the title of my TED talk is Social Climate Change. And hopefully by the end of this talk, you will know what I mean by this. You hear often say that data is the new oil. And I think there's truth in that. Just as oil was a key resource has been a key resource of the industrial economy, so data is becoming a key resource of the information economy. We can think of these leading companies that are central to our economy here that run essentially on data. But if we're going to embrace the data is the new oil analogy, then we have to embrace it in whole. We have to accept that oil also creates oil pollution. And I'm thinking here of 2 types of pollution, in particular oil spills on the left, and global climate change and global warming on the right through the buildup of fossil fuel emissions. And so I think that the analogy holds on that level as well, that data creates harms that are analogous to both of these types of environmental harms from oil. To begin with, we have the fact of data breaches and data being released inadvertently out into the information environment. We just recently saw Equifax, massive data broker releasing 143 million people's records with social security numbers and names and credit card numbers and the like. And in the field, there is a name for this. They call it a data spill. And I think it's actually very analogous to oil spills. Oil has a second main environmental injury, which is the release of fossil fuel emissions. Burning of fossil fuel released emissions causes global climate change. Of course, this comes from polluters large, thinking of power plants, and small. Each of us, as we drive our cars collectively, creates a large contribution to climate change. And these emissions of greenhouse gases build up in the atmosphere, whereas we know by now they trap the sun's heat and so cause global warming, also known as climate change, which changes our climate in ways that make it less hospitable for life in nature, human life, etc., and causes other issues as well, droughts, more intense storms and floods, and the like. So that's climate change, and fossil fuels contribute to that. Well, I think privacy injuries are quite similar. They are large and small. We recently experienced and learned of a relatively large privacy injury from the Facebook Cambridge Analytica episode, in which the data, personal data, Facebook data of 87 million of Facebook's users was released to Cambridge Analytica without their consent and then used to create manipulative ads, political ads. So that's a kind of a big, I'm thinking about that like the power plant. But, when we send or receive a Gmail, Google reads it. Or I think they may have stopped that practice in 2017. In any event, up until 2017, they don't have individuals read it, they have machines read it for keywords to market stuff to us. So if you're emailing to your cancer doctor or your psychiatrist or your best friend or whatever, that is being read in a sense. And I think of that as kind of a small injury. It's like a small emission of our personal information, kind of like the particles of pollution out of a smokestack that adds up. We're getting lots of these data emissions all over our lives all the time. Our cell phones right now are tracking where we are, et cetera, et cetera. So we're emitting this data all the time, and it too is collecting and building up in the cloud. I mean, it's really, this analogy works beautifully. We've got greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We've got personal data up there in the cloud from all these different sources accumulating, just like greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere. And I think this is having an effect. This is changing the social climate in which we live in ways that make it less hospitable for human growth, human flourishing. We are having the sense that we are observed, that what we're doing, even our Google searches, just think how intimate that is, are being recorded, stored. And I think that changes our sense of the climate environment, the information environment in which we're living in ways that make us feel, a little more hesitant, a little bit chilled in our expression. There was an interesting event that, I'm trying to remember the specifics here. Okay, forget it, I'll move on to that. The best analogy for this, or a representation of it, is Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon. This was a prison that he designed and invested in, where every prisoner cell was completely visible from this guard house here. So prisoners were always being observed. And he said, then they will behave better because they know they're always being watched. And eventually you can even remove the guard from the tower and they'll still behave better because they believe they're being watched. And, we all experience that. If you ever had a police car pull up behind you, right? Like now you're driving real, carefully, right? So if being watched does affect our behavior, and if indeed we are being watched all the time, private sector and to some extent, with government surveillance, then that maybe affects our sense of, how we behave or what we can do and what we can't do. Are we becoming like these prisoners in the Panopticon prison? So I think this is a helpful analogy, the climate change to social climate change on several levels. First of all, you'll have the sense that something is happening with our, that all this data is being emitted and we're giving it up, and there's these data breaches, and Facebook's doing certain things, and Google's got a lot of our information, and it's being released and captured and shared, and we don't really know what's going on. We have a sense that something is happening, but we can't really put our finger on it. And I think that, kind of climate change gives us a nice concept to kind of grasp what's going on. Just like with changes in the physical climate, you can't see it, right? It's happening all around us, but you can't see it's going to have some future effects, but it's very hard to see it happening. Now, I think that's similar here. We can't see it, but it's happening all around us. And so I would argue that we are living today not just through an era of climate change, but also through an era of social climate change. And that these changes are hard to see, just like with climate change, but we need to address them. And that if we do not address them, if we do not change our ways, we are in danger of bequeathing to our children a social environment, a social climate that is less conducive to human development and human flourishing than the one that we inherited from our parents. And so we need to make some changes to address that. I also like the analogy because it leads to a catchy term for what is happening. I call it the glass house effect. Climate change is the greenhouse effect. This is the glass house effect. We all feel that we are increasingly living in a glass house where we are being observed. And maybe that is just making us a little bit more careful, chilling our expression, our experimentation, our, figuring out who we are and expressing who we are. Maybe just inhibiting that a bit. This glass house is out in nature, right? There's nobody there to observe them, but ours, in a sense, are right in the city. And I think that if we can name this, we can put a name on what's happening, we can start to grasp it, then maybe it feels a little bit more manageable to address it. So I think that's another function here, which takes us to the second way that the climate change analogy is useful, not just grasping it and not just putting a catchy name on it, but giving us ideas about how to address it, what kinds of action to take. And I'm mindful of this Harvard Business Review article by two business professors. They talk about the power of analogy. If you have a current problem, you can analogize it to a prior problem, and you then
not when you want it to.
Oh, there we go. Figure it out. In any event, then there were solutions to the prior problem. You can get ideas from them about possible solutions to the current problem. So that's the power of analogy, to think about action. They were talking about it in a business context, and like business people thinking strategically. They have a problem, they can analogize it to another problem that they solved before, and then think about the solutions for that other problem and try and map them onto the current one and get ideas for the current one. And so I think we can do the same thing with policy. Now, we haven't been totally successful in dealing with oil pollution and climate change, but we have made some progress, so maybe we can draw from some of those ideas. If we think about the oil spill piece of this, if we think about how the law has evolved in climate change and oil pollution, what we had at the beginning was subsidies. Our government wanted more oil to be generated and more oil to be transported. We had, for example, limitation of liability laws, where if your ship ran aground and you despoiled a beach with oil, you were only liable for the value of the cargo remaining. That's a real subsidy, right? By not forcing these parties to pay for the harm that they cause. And so that has changed. We now hold oil transporters liable for their spills, and they have much higher liability caps. So I think we need something similar with respect to privacy law and policy. We've got a kind of a subsidy system now. If you spill data, all you really have to do under data security breach laws is notify people. There's some expense in that, but you are not internalizing the full cost of the externalities you have created, of the harms you've created. So I think we need to change law in a way that forces companies to internalize the cost that they've created. In the environmental field, they call it making the polluters pay. And I think we need something similar here. So that's kind of one way we can think through analogy to get ideas about what we need to do. Another thing that we have seen, specifically with respect to climate change, is the need for technological innovation, right? We address climate change by developing new renewable fuel sources, right? Solar and wind and geothermal, and to get a handle on this issue, we need to produce new types of technology. And I think there's going to be a demand, for new types of data technologies that use less information to achieve the same ends, that are more efficient in that way, that are less polluting in that way. And I would argue that we should be investing as a society in those technological solutions. There's market failures involved in this. This is often fundamental research that has positive externalities when it is discovered, and so companies can't capture all of the benefits of that, so they underinvest. There may be a role for government to invest in some of these privacy-enhancing technologies, like differential privacy, way of doing data mining without being able to tell whether any specific individual is in the database or not. So technological innovation, I think, is the second thing we can think about by analogy. And finally, I think that we can learn from the sustainability example. In the climate change area, it took a while, but companies learned that if they don't address this problem, it's going to come back to hurt them. And so, you know, in their own interests and in the interest of being more responsible citizens, they need to start to act to reduce their own carbon footprint. We've seen that in the last 10, 15 years. Companies really, you know, kind of leading to some extent on reducing their carbon footprint and taking more responsibility for this. And I think we're facing a very similar thing here, that in order for companies to function in the digital economy, they need trust. They need the trust of their users. And if they despoil that, if they wreck that by abusive data practices, they will hurt themselves. And so in order to sustain their own long-term interests and their own long-term business plan, right, and that's the notion of sustainability as well, they need to act more responsibly. And I think Facebook, we have a very good example of that just in the last few weeks, right? Facebook allowed this abusive practice, and they have lost $100 billion in shareholder value. This affects, this loss of trust really affects the business. So I think this sustainability mindset, you know, companies acting in their own enlightened self-interest and being more responsible is something that we can, that is needed here. And I think we're starting to see it. And it goes by the name of data ethics. And this is a recent book, Data Ethics, The New Competitive Advantage. And you're seeing kind of leading companies start to articulate policies and processes for doing data ethics, which I think is kind of like corporate social responsibility for data. And I think that's the next wave of corporate social responsibility. I'm actually leading a research project on this, which is one of the most fun things that I'm doing and our program is doing. So we've got an interdisciplinary team, colleagues from the business school, philosophy department, because we're dealing with ethics, sociology, computer science, and we are studying leading companies that use big data and what are their ethical, what is their approach to data ethics? What processes are they using for this? What substantive frameworks are they using? And this has been really fun. We're doing interviews with some of the leading companies, and we will be doing a survey much more broadly to, you know, discover who is being active on this and what are they doing. Mainly descriptive is our goal, to kind of describe the current state of the art. Insofar as we can identify practices that are working better than others, we will also help to articulate best practices. Just one or two more slides here. You know, we're only a third of the way into this research project, so there's not a lot of findings I can share with you right now. But one preliminary finding is that we're seeing the rise of a new position in companies, the Chief Data Ethics Officer. We've seen companies where they had a Chief Privacy Officer who has now become the Chief Data Ethics Officer. The privacy department has become the data ethics. It incorporates privacy, but it's broader than that. And I wonder, is that the way of the future, and is that kind of the new corporate social responsibility and sustainability for the information economy, much like we've had environmental sustainability for climate change and industrial economy? That as well.
Yeah, Dennis, is there any level to get a hold of any of this? I know that the EU is adopting much more stringent privacy laws next month.
Yeah.
And some of us in the room have to figure out how that affects our clients and ourselves. But is there any real effort?
There's a bit. The closest thing during the Obama administration, the president ordered a 90-day review of big data. If any of you are interested in this, a special committee produced a report, and then something called the President's Commission on Science and Technology, PCAST, did another more technical-oriented report on this. And they got at some of these issues, and the FTC has done something on big data and discrimination, which is another piece of this. I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of the European approach, which is very privacy-oriented and notice and consent oriented. So privacy is the ability to control your personal information, and it is generally through privacy law achieved through notice and consent. These are the notices we get, from our banks, et cetera, every year. And the EU has kind of taken that to a whole new level. My view is that big data analytics doesn't lend itself well to notice and consent. And you need another type of regulation that doesn't just rely on individual control, but actually creates some social controls as to kind of what is permissible, what's not, what's appropriate, what's not, what's fair, what's unfair. When I think sometimes about the program on data and governance, which focuses on big data analytics, and I'm not the only one saying this, others in the academy and the legal academy and elsewhere are writing about this, that our traditional privacy law system premised on notice and consent doesn't really work as well for the big data economy. We need kind of a new paradigm of privacy law and policy to protect people in this new age. I think that is, at a broad level, the mission of the program on data and governance, is to help think about that and help to create that new paradigm. So it's what I work on in my own scholarship on various levels. It's what the program on data and governance is working on. I personally don't, there are aspects of the European model that I like, privacy impact assessments, privacy by design, things that kind of go beyond notice and consent, but I'm not sure that the solution here is for the US to adopt the European model. That's just my view.
So I think Dennis can hang out after the
Absolutely,
meeting informally to take more questions, but I need to bring the official meeting to a close. So before I do that, first join me in thanking Professor